Greetings everyone. Today we're going to tackle half-blind dovetails. What we're going to do today is hopefully break this down into manageable chunks, manageable easy chunks, and we'll go through step by step and go from simple to just a little bit more complex as we go. I'll show you the half-blind dovetail. Okay? So, and one of the easy ways to remember this, it's the dovetail. So as these are the tails, and the easy way to remember that is they stick out like the tail on a dog. So if these are the tails, these are the tail sockets, these are the pins, and then these are the pin sockets. The first thing that we'll look at today is breaking it down into essentially 5 steps. 5 things in terms of the material that you're using, jig setup, and also router setup. So let's begin with, and today I'm going to use the Porter Cable half blind dovetail jig. This is the 24-inch Omni jig. They don't make this anymore, but this was the jig that I bought many years ago simply because I liked its construction, I liked the way it was built. Now I'm not going to go through this jig specifically today in terms of setting up the Porter Cable Omni jig. Today's video is simply just about learning and understanding how to get very good results with making half blinds, very good half blind results. So if you look at how these pieces go into just the jig itself, you can see that the pieces are nested together and you end up routing one as you end up routing both. So when you do one, you get the mating piece to it. So the way that these two pieces index and go into this jig, or whether or not it's any other half blind dovetail jig, the importance of having these two pieces cut to the best of your ability, and that's all 6 faces being square. Okay, so squareness in flat. So flatness, flat face, parallel face, square faces, and square faces. That's extremely important. So that's why, in terms of starting, number 1 is squareness of material. Okay? And these pieces fitting in there, and to exaggerate, if one was cut, if I had the end of this one cut at 1 degree or 2 degrees, to exaggerate, those pieces are going to end up going in and fitting funny after you end up routing them, if you get a decent result with the router to begin with. Because once we route and come through those two pieces nesting together, if this isn't square in any of those faces, you may not get the results that you're after. The next one is concentricity, and I'll explain that. And in this pile of stuff that I have out, because what we're using here, this is a 5/8 OD guide bushing, and I have a half inch cutting diameter 14-degree dovetail bit with a 1/2 inch shank. And I'm using all of this because that's what this jig calls for. So it's a 5/8 diameter guide bushing, a 1/2 inch 14-degree dovetail bit with a 1/2 inch shank. And that 1/2 inch shank is important. You can get by with a 1/4 inch shank or an 8mm shank, but the 1/2 inch shank is important because the bit's a little bit stiffer and you have a little bit less chatter. Okay, so the concentricity, meaning that this bit is centered within this guide bushing, as close as what we can get. And I'll talk a little bit about, and I'll show it on the board too, and I'll show a little bit about how to get this base plate concentric with the center of the collet on the router. So to exaggerate, if this is the base plate of my router, there's my router, and that's my 5/8 guide bushing in my base plate, and this dovetail bit is sticking down. Okay? If that is concentric in terms of my drawing versus, and again I'll exaggerate this, versus there. Okay? So if you look at this, and because with the jig, this guide bushing is going to rest and roll in and out of this comb. Okay? And if I had this example of the exaggerated example, if I hold my router like that, I'm going to get one result. If I hold my router like this, I'm going to get a different result. If I hold it like this, I'll get an even different result. So that's why having that bit concentric with this guide bushing is important, because there's stops for the left and the right hand side, there's depth of comb, and we'll get to all of that. But having that router bit concentric in relationship to that, having the guide bushing concentric in relationship to that collet is extremely important. And these are a Porter cable style guide bushing, which is what we're going to use. These, and this is a 5/8 guide bushing, and when it goes into the base plate of your router, that guide bushing fits in that already machined hole in the base plate of your router, and then it has a brass nut, that's brass as well, then it has a brass nut that threads on from the back side and holds that in place. Different router manufacturers, this is a DeWalt router, different router manufacturers have different setups for guide bushings, but these are about the best that I've found in terms of its accuracy and adjustability. Okay, so let's talk about how we get this base plate concentric. This is a white side inlay kit. And we're not going to talk about inlays today, but, and maybe we'll do a video in the future, but this is the type of thing that this inlay kit allows you to do. Okay, but also within this inlay kit, and this is the important part, I use this, and they have it specifically in there in this kit. It comes with a concentricity pin. This is 1/4 inch diameter, and this is a smaller diameter, which fits on the inside of this inlay kit. Okay, and I'll show you why that's important. I have a 1/4 inch shank collet in my router, and that guide bushing, or that guide pin, concentricity pin, and I'm just putting it in there hand tight. Okay, so whenever I put the base plate on, and I'll drop that down just a little bit. Gotta take the nut off, dummy. And I've loosened up this base plate so you can see it moving around. These are counterbore holes in this piece of plastic, and right now it just moves around. So at the factory they're putting these on, and somebody's or machine is tightening these up, and it's not getting it perfectly concentric. So never trust the fact that even if your router is brand new out of the box, that base plate is going to be concentric with the center of the collet. So here, and as I wiggle this around, you can see that base plate has moved just enough. It's got enough slop in it that I can begin to move that around. And I should have that tight. Okay, and once I have that just the way I want it in terms of indexing, begin to tighten your base plate. Then test it. Still good. Tighten it just a touch more. Good. And then tighten it up. Okay? So it's real close. Now, if I was doing this for my setup where I was getting ready to set up for drawers or whatever it was, I would spend just a little extra time and try to make that as perfect as what I could get it. But having that concentric is exactly what you need for doing dovetails. Now, we're not using this for routing dovetails, but if I have that base plate concentric, then I just drop in my 5/8 OD guide bushing and thread the nut on the back side, and then I'm ready to go. So that's exactly what I did whenever I set this one up. It's exactly what I did. I had probably that inlay kit and adjusted my base plate, got it just the way that I wanted it, put my 5/8 OD guide bushing in, and then threaded the brass nut on the back side. And that brass nut, you want to make sure it's tight, but don't feel like you have to get a pipe wrench and a cheater bar in there to lock it down forever. It needs to be past snug. You want to make sure it's past snug, then that's perfect. This one's been on here. I set this router up years ago, maybe. I've leave this set up just the way that it is, so that whenever I'm ready to do dovetails, I can pull this out of the cabinet and I'm ready to set up for doing dovetails. Because going through the process of getting bit height set, and we'll get to that next, and making sure that all this is concentric takes a little bit of time. I'd rather have this set up and dedicated to doing dovetails, which is the way I have it. The next one is depth of cut. And I put a little 1 by it because there's 2 different depths of cut. That has to do with the projection or the depth that this router bit is sticking out past this base plate. So when I have this router bit sitting on my jig, that bit is going to project down, obviously past the comb or the template, and it needs to cut a certain depth in the wood. And that certain depth is so that whenever we go to put these 2 pieces of this drawer, or whatever it is that we're making together, that I get just that perfect fit whenever I put these pieces together. And that depth of cut can be a little bit fussy in terms of getting it just the way that you want it. Okay? So I'm going to go back to the board and draw this and try to draw it so that, again, I've got my router, my guide bushing, and it's concentric already, and I've got my dovetail bit projecting through. Okay? So if I draw, and I'll make it giant here. Okay? And there's my board and my router bit. Okay? Where that bit is in terms of its depth changes the tightness of that joint, or how that joint comes together and ultimately fits together. And here's why. This, as I described earlier, is our 1/2 inch in terms of the width of that router bit. That's going to stay the same. As I change, and I'll draw that a little steeper, to exaggerate, as I change this depth of cut, this width is going to stay the same. But I'll go ahead and draw it solid. But that bit is going to eliminate or cut that much material based on where I have that bit depth set. Okay? So the easy way to remember this is what I've always had to do is come up with a mnemonic device. Yeah. So that I can remember which way I need to go. So the rule of thumb is heighten to tighten, lower to loosen with the router upside down. Okay? So if I heighten this bit with the router upside down, if I heighten this bit, which is going to drop it in this direction, that's going to make that joint tighter. If I lower this bit, it's going to make that joint looser. So heighten to tighten, lower to loosen with the router upside down. And that's, if you remember that part, that's the reason why. And we'll get into that. Okay? Is depth of cut 2. These two pieces in that jig are going to fit together this way. They're going to rest in that jig and be clamped in that jig that way. So my depth of cut, the first one, is this way. And that, when these pieces come together, that dictates how this joint ultimately comes together. If it's too loose, it'll just bottom out or could just fall right in. And if it's too tight, I have to put it together with a hammer. And the rule of thumb for me with woodworking is if you have to put it together with your hat, it's too loose. If you have to put it together with your hammer, it's too tight. Find that in between area. Now you see what I've done. I've got my soft blow mallet, right? Now that's not a hammer, but you can understand my point is that I'm just barely have to touch that in order to get those to come together so that it's nice and flush. With this depth of cut, and again, those pieces are in the router and in the jig this way. With this depth of cut, I'm talking about the depth of cut of these tail sockets. And when I'm over at my jig, where this comb is adjusted this way in and out dictates how deep these tail sockets are. So to exaggerate, and I don't have that much depth of comb, but again to exaggerate, if I had the jig set up so that they routed that deep all the way across, that would mean that this tailboard could drop that deep, and that's not what we're after for this demonstration. We're after this in terms of the flushness. So that's depth of cut 2. It's the offset of the stops. In this Porter cable jig, and I think every other single half-blind jig that I've ever seen or used, these two pieces are offset a certain distance. Now on this one, what we're going to use today, this offset is a 1/2 inch. Okay? The offset is a 1/2 inch. Your jig may be something different than 1/2 inch. It may call for 5/8. It may call for 3/8. But it'll be in the instructions on your jig. But know that those offsets, and typically on half-blind jigs, those offsets, you have a left side, you have a right side offset, and you also have a left side offset. For what we're doing today, I'm not going to use those, but I need to point those out that there are offsets that are going to be built into your jig and you will need to use those. So those are the 5 steps in terms of setting up this jig. There are other things in there in terms of clamp tightness. That's important so that you don't have to feel like you've got to, because you don't want the boards moving around, but you don't want to have to tweak your jig or torque your jig. trying to get it extra tight. I have my clamp set up on this so that right there is tight, and that isn't going anywhere. Right here is tight, and that's not going anywhere. Okay? So I've got a couple pieces set up in our jig. And as we said before, talking about number one in terms of the square-ness material, because these pieces index themselves with a 1/2 inch offset. And having these pieces square, because you want this as flush as what you can get it, all the way across, and the 1/2 inch offset between the two. So having these pieces square makes a big difference in terms of how they clamp into the jig itself. Okay? With our router, and this one's already set up in terms of depth of cut and concentricity, and I also have my comb set up in terms of depth of cut, and I do have my 1/2 inch offset. So the first thing we do is, and I'll show you, having this router set up on this jig, because essentially half of it, be aware that you can get this, so you want to make sure that you're holding your router flat, and you want to make sure that you're not engaged with the wood when you turn the router on. Okay? And you just, and you'll develop a feel for it. But the first cut that I do is, typically handheld routing operation is a left to right. Okay? On this first cut, and I'll show this to you, I actually go from right to left. So it's a climb cut. The router bit wants to help itself along, so you have to be a little bit aware of that, but I'm not going full depth. All I'm doing is doing a climb cut so that I'm scoring this material, and I'm minimizing the risk of blowing off these corners in my finished piece. So I'll show that one to you to begin with. All right, here we go. So the first cut I'm going to make is going to be that climb scoring cut, and all I'm going to do is score across that. I'll stop and let you guys see that. And that's enough, and I didn't take very much, but it's just barely scoring this edge. Maybe I could have had a little bit more in there than what I did, okay? But all that is just a scoring cut, because that will get seen on the inside of this drawer box, because this is that piece. That edge right there will get seen on the inside of your drawer box, okay? And you want to try to have that nice. And there's a corner that could blow out if I don't do that climb cut. And sometimes this corner blows out, which is this back corner, because I can't climb cut there, but you'll see it, okay? The other thing that I want to stress are two things. Remember, this is the 800-pound gorilla. Don't allow it to get close enough to you so that it can hurt you, okay? Pay attention to this first. This is going to be, whatever you did, this is going to be the exact same now and in 5 minutes. So pay attention to this first. Whenever I make this cut and I'm done with this cut, I turn the router off, I spin it, and I do this. I intentionally put it on the ground. And the reason that I do that is that's where it's going to be whenever I kick the cord and knock the router off the bench. Okay? Now, I'll route this as if I was doing it all at once. And it came out okay. Okay? Now, that can be, I can tap them just a little bit more in terms of getting that just about nearly perfectly flush. Got to leave a little bit of room for glue, but not too much. And we'll cover that whenever we actually do a dovetail drawer box. Now, here's some things that you should be aware of. When you've done all of this and you've made your cuts, if there is something that needs to be changed on any of this, now hopefully these two once they're set up, or if you're cutting accurate material, these two you can take out of the equation. But the rest of these three, in terms of changing something, if you route and you don't get the result that you're after, change one of these at a time. And I don't have to write that on the board, but change one of these at a time. Don't adjust two things. Get your depth of cut next in terms of depth of cut 1. And if you remember, that was the router bit, the heighten to tighten, lower to loosen, with the router upside down. Get that right. Then change your depth of cut 2, which is the depth of this comb in and out, which dictates the depth of these tail sockets. Okay, change that second. And then if you're getting a slight step in terms of when you go to put these two pieces together, that is adjusting your stops in terms of the offset of your stops. Okay, so but change one of those at a time. Now the last three things, and I talked about the climb scoring cut to begin with. Here's also another thing that I talk about and try to teach. Here's some user guides whenever you're actually going to route these materials, okay? Independent of these. Make that climb cut. That climb cut to begin with where you're going backwards. Here's also another one, and I'll show you this, and maybe the camera will pick this up. But this is the front, say, of this drawer box. So when I open this drawer, you'll see the dovetails front and back, okay? If this is the front of my drawer box and the side, and then I'd obviously have the mating side and the mating back, okay? I always orient these pieces so that the center of the tree is towards the outside of the drawer box. Now, if you have a drawer or a piece of wood that maybe has a knot showing on one face and maybe not a knot showing on the other face, you can index that however you want. But a good rule of thumb is the center of the tree towards the outside of the drawer box. And then when I cut these, and it's the same for the side, the center of the tree towards the out, and I'll tell you why here in a minute. But whenever I cross cut these to length, the front, I have the face side down on the cross cut. So if there's any tear out, that tear out is here, and that can be sanded after the fact when you knock these edges over, because if you have that tear out, and this piece was routed this way, when I go to put it together, that tear out line shows, if there's any, shows right here. And the same is true. And the same is true on this piece, but this piece is face up on cross cut, so that if I have any tear out, not only is it in the center, but it also gets cut off whenever we do that climb cut in the router. Okay? Whereas if I had the bit of tear out, it would show up here on the outside of those tails. And that can require just a little bit, maybe a little bit more sanding than what you want to do. And when we do a video on actually going through and making the entire dovetail drawer box, I'll show you those two and how I orient those, and so that we get a good clean route. Okay? And you see the little tear out, these two pieces have been around a long time, and putting them together, taking them apart so many times, you end up bumping some corners off of something. But on this one, I did the same thing, to where if this was my front or my back, okay, if this was my front or my back, I have the tear out here, so the face side down on crosscut. So I have no tear out here. My face side up on crosscut, okay, so that if there's any tear out, it's on the inside. And that comes together and makes a pretty clean dovetail joint all the way through. So hopefully what we did today is helpful and beneficial, and it gets you started on the right path to having success. Because the first time you have success, then you'll enjoy the hobby even more. So if you like what we've done, the next thing that we're going to do is actually pieces machined, and we'll go through building a dovetail drawer, and we'll do it from start to finish. So if you like what we've done today, like, subscribe, leave a comment, ask questions, and we will do the best to get some more content up. Thanks so much. Boards line up and they're offset. Well, that's a good one right there. New Albany, Indiana.
It's not plugged in.
Okay, we're gonna put that on the bloopers. Do you know how many times I've tried to get a machine to work, a tool to work, and this isn't done, and it just simply won't happen? It's really annoying. Okay?